The vast Wyoming prairie stretched out in every direction like a great rumpled blanket of gold and green. Upon this immense land sat a small wooden ranch house, its paint weathered by sun and wind. This was the home of Elara, and it was a very lonely home indeed. She had lived there with her father, but after he passed, the silence that settled over the ranch was heavier than any winter snow. Elara was brave and strong. She knew how to mend a fence, herd the stubborn sheep, and read the sky for coming storms. But the one thing she could not seem to fix was the hollow feeling inside her chest, the feeling that echoed the emptiness of the land around her. Her only conversations were with the bleating sheep and the whispering wind. One afternoon, she was looking through an old agricultural journal for tips on treating a sick ewe. Her eyes were tired from reading and from squinting in the bright sun. As she turned to the very back pages, a small boxed advertisement caught her eye. It was different from the ones selling plows or seed. It was placed by a person. It read, "Well-educated gentleman from Boston seeks partnership on a frontier homestead. A hard worker seeks a quiet life. Object, matrimony." Elara read the words again, and then again. A gentleman from Boston? What could he possibly know about hard work or a quiet life? She imagined a man in a stiff suit, completely lost on a ranch like hers. It seemed like a foolish idea. But as the days passed, the advertisement kept popping into her thoughts. The loneliness felt sharper. The silence felt deeper. One evening, under the soft glow of her oil lamp, she took out a piece of paper and a pencil. Her hand trembled slightly. What could she possibly say to a stranger? She decided to simply tell the truth. She wrote about her life on the ranch. She wrote about the challenges and the small joys. She asked him about Boston and why he would want to leave it. She sealed the letter with a mixture of fear and hope, sending it off into the unknown, wondering if she would ever get a reply, wondering if she had just made the biggest mistake of her life. The days that followed the sending of her letter took on a new and peculiar rhythm for Elara. The chores were the same, the sun rose and set on the same schedule, and the sheep demanded just as much attention as they ever had. Yet everything felt different. A tiny, fragile seed of anticipation had been planted deep within her, and each morning she awoke to the quiet question of whether today might be the day it would sprout. The journey to the small post office in town, once a tedious monthly errand for supplies and the occasional bit of business, now became a weekly event, fraught with a nervous energy she could not quite name. She would ride her old horse, Juniper, along the dusty path, her mind concocting and then dismissing 100 scenarios. He would not have written back. The letter would have been formal and cold, a polite rejection. He would think her simple and uninteresting. The postmaster, a kind and perpetually dusty man named Mr. Gable, would merely shake his head on those first few visits, and Elara would try to hide her profound disappointment behind a request for a bag of flour or a new hammer. Then, one Tuesday, everything changed. The air was crisp with the promise of an early autumn, and the aspen leaves were just beginning to whisper of gold. Mr. Gable did not shake his head. Instead, he reached beneath his counter and produced not the thin, common paper she used, but a thick, creamy envelope. It felt substantial in her hand, weighty with importance. Her name and address were written in a handwriting so precise and elegant it looked like it belonged in a museum. Each letter formed with a confident, flowing grace. In the upper left corner was the return address, a street in Boston whose name sounded grand and imposing. Elara's heart began to beat a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She managed to pay for a few small items, her fingers trembling, and all but fled the post office, the letter burning a hole in her pocket. She did not open it on the ride home. She held the strange and wonderful artifact, feeling its crisp edges through the fabric of her coat, saving the experience. It felt like a ceremony that required the right setting. Back at the ranch, after unsaddling Juniper and ensuring the sheep were content for the moment, she finally sat at her small kitchen table, the envelope before her. She took a knife and carefully slit it open, treating the paper with a reverence she usually reserved for her father's old Bible. The letter inside was just as fine, and the handwriting was even more beautiful up close, a dark, sharp ink against the pristine white. She began to read. "My dear Miss Elara, please allow me to first express my sincere gratitude for your letter. It was a most welcome and unexpected surprise in what is typically a rather predictable round of daily correspondence. To receive a letter from Wyoming, a place I must confess I have only ever seen represented upon a map, was a singular event. Your words painted a vivid picture of a life so entirely foreign to my own that I have found myself thinking of little else these past days. You asked about Boston, and why I might wish to leave it. It is a fair and logical question, and one I feel I must answer with honesty. From the outside, my life here is one of ease and privilege. I live in a fine brownstone home. I attend concerts and lectures and social gatherings. My family is well regarded, and there is an expectation that I will follow a very specific path, one that has been trod by the men in my family for generations. It is a path of banking, of board meetings, of polite conversation in drawing rooms. It is by every conventional measure a good life. But, Miss Elara, if I may be so bold, I find it to be a life devoid of substance. It is like being served the most beautifully crafted, elaborately decorated dessert, only to discover it has no flavor. The conversations are scripts, rehearsed and repeated. The days are a procession of obligations, one following the next with a monotonous certainty. I feel at times like a spectator in my own life, or worse, a prop upon a stage, moved here and there to suit the narrative of others. There is a great deal of noise, but very little music. There is constant motion, but no sense of actually getting anywhere. I long for a purpose that is tangible. I wish to use my hands for more than turning the pages of a ledger or shaking the hand of a business associate. I wish to look at a thing at the end of the day and know that I built it, or grew it, or fixed it with my own effort. I wish for a quiet that is not the absence of sound, but the presence of peace. You wrote of the silence of your nights under the stars. That is not a silence I have ever truly known. The city is never quiet. My life here is never quiet. Your description of your ranch, of the stubbornness of sheep and the satisfaction of a fence well mended, sounded not like hardship to me, but like a kind of poetry. It sounds real. I hope this confession does not alarm you or cause you to think less of me. It is simply the truth of my heart. Yours most sincerely, Alistair Finch. Elara read the letter once. Then she read it again, slower this time, absorbing each sentence. The man who wrote these words was not the stiff, unknowable figure she had imagined. He was thoughtful. He was eloquent in a way that was not showy, but deeply felt. He was unhappy, trapped in a gilded cage of his own inheritance. His longing for something real resonated with her own loneliness so powerfully it was almost a physical ache. He understood. He understood the value of a hard day's work, even if he had never experienced it. He understood the difference between empty noise and true quiet. She knew she must write back immediately. She fetched her own paper and her pencil, but suddenly they seemed shabby and inadequate compared to the fine stationery she had just received. She felt a pang of insecurity. What could she, a simple ranch woman, possibly have to say to a man who went to concerts and lectures? But then she remembered his words. It sounds real. He did not want fancy words or grand ideas. He wanted the truth. She began to write, her own handwriting, practical and straightforward, a stark contrast to his. Dear Mr. Finch, thank you for your letter. I was very glad to receive it. I must tell you, your paper is so fine I was almost afraid to touch it for fear of leaving a smudge. Your life in Boston does sound very busy and very loud. I cannot imagine never knowing quiet. The quiet out here is my constant companion. Sometimes it is a comfort, like a soft blanket. Other times, I will admit, It feels heavy and isolating. But after reading your letter, I think I will appreciate it more now, knowing it is something another person might value. You asked about the sheep. They're contrary creatures, each with their own personality. There is one old ewe I call Queenie because she believes the entire pasture belongs to her and she leads the others into all sorts of mischief, usually finding the one hole in the fence I have not yet patched. Mending that fence is a constant job. The wind and the weather work at it, and the animals test it. But there is a good feeling that comes when you hammer in the last nail and lean against the post and know you have made something strong and secure, something that will protect what is yours. It is a plain sort of satisfaction, but it is a true one. The stars are another thing altogether. Without any city lights, the sky at night is so full of them, it's like a spilled treasure chest of diamonds. On a clear night, you can see the Milky Way, a great cloudy path of light stretching across the heavens. It is so vast, it makes you feel very small, but in a way that is comforting, not frightening. It reminds you that your worries are small too in the grand scheme of things. I don't know if this is the kind of thing you wish to hear about. It is not as exciting as a concert, I am sure, but it is my life. Sincerely, Elara. And so it began. A correspondence that spanned a continent, bridging two worlds that could not have been more different. Letters traveled back and forth over the weeks, each one a little piece of themselves offered up to the other. The formal Mr. Finch and Miss Elara soon softened, by unspoken mutual agreement, to Alistair and Elara. The letters themselves grew longer, the topics deepening. Alistair wrote to her about music, describing the way a symphony could build and swell, telling a story without any words at all. He wrote to her about the books he was reading, histories of the very frontier she inhabited, and philosophical texts that question the meaning of a life well lived. He confessed that his interest in those books had been a source of gentle ridicule from his brothers, who saw them as a distraction from the practical matters of finance. He wrote with a wit that was dry and clever, often aimed at the absurdities of the social functions he was forced to attend. He described a recent ball as a festival of whispered gossip and overly elaborate desserts, where the greatest peril is not a misstep in the dance, but a misstep in conversation that might offend someone's delicate sensibilities. Elara wrote back with equal honesty. She described the thrill of a spring lambing season, the anxiety and joy of helping a new life into the world. She told him about the relentless summer sun and the constant worry over water for the stock. She wrote of the taste of dust on the air before a storm, and the incredible, life-giving smell of the prairie after the rain had fallen. She shared her small triumphs, like finally mastering the recipe for her father's favorite cornbread, and her frustrations, like the time a pack of coyotes spooked the herd, and she spent a whole night riding the fence line to calm them. They were building a friendship, stone by stone, word by word. They were discovering the shape of each other's character through the stories they chose to tell. Elara learned that Alistair was not just tired of his life, he was intellectually restless, hungry for authenticity, and possessed of a dry humor that hid a deep well of sensitivity. Elara learned that Alistair was not just a hardy pioneer woman, she was observant, deeply intelligent in the ways of the natural world, resilient, and possessed of a quiet poetry in her soul. The mailbox became the focal point of their lives.
The letter that contained her bold question was sent out into the world, and a silence followed that felt louder than any Elara had ever known. The days stretched, each one longer than the last, as she waited for a reply. The autumn wind, once a familiar whisper through the tall grass, now seemed to carry a taunting note, reminding her of the vast and empty distance between her ranch and a city called Boston. She replayed her own words in her mind, worrying she had been too forward, too blunt, that she had shattered the delicate, beautiful thing they had built with their letters. Perhaps she had frightened him away for good. The thought was a cold stone in her stomach. Just as she was convincing herself she had ruined everything, a letter arrived. It was not on his usual fine stationery, but on a simpler, sturdier paper, as if it were a document of great import. The handwriting, though still elegant, seemed less controlled. The letters formed with a new kind of energy. Her hands trembled as she broke the seal. My dearest Elara, Your question was not bold. It was necessary, and I thank you for your courage in asking it. You have offered me nothing but honesty from the beginning, and I owe you the same in return. Let me be perfectly clear. This correspondence has been the furthest thing from a diversion. It has been a lifeline. The world you have shown me is not a fantasy I escape to. It is the future I wish to build. I have made my decision. I am coming to Wyoming. There are arrangements to be made, of course, affairs to settle. I will need a few weeks to disentangle myself from my obligations here in a way that will not cause undue difficulty for my family, but I will be on the train that arrives in your town on the afternoon of November the 12th. You asked if my wish for a different life is real. I will prove it to you not with more words on a page, but with my presence. I am under no illusions. I know I will be a novice in every aspect of ranch life. I expect to be clumsy. I expect to make mistakes. I only ask for your patience and your guidance. I am a willing student, and I believe I am a fast learner. This is the realest decision I have ever made. I am choosing a life of substance over a life of show. I am choosing the possibility of true partnership over the certainty of lonely comfort. I will see you soon, Elara. Yours, Alistair. Elara read the letter once, then again, and a third time, each reading sending a fresh wave of shock and exhilaration through her. He was coming. He was truly coming. The abstract man made of ink and paper was going to become a real person, standing on her porch, breathing her air. The reality of it was terrifying and thrilling in equal measure. The following weeks were a whirlwind of frantic activity, a welcome distraction from the nervous anticipation that fluttered constantly in her chest. The ranch, which usually settled into a slower rhythm for winter, was suddenly the site of a great preparation. She cleaned the small, spare bedroom that had been her father's with a ferocity she didn't know she possessed, airing out the blankets and dusting every surface until it shone. She stocked the pantry with more supplies than she could possibly need, as if preparing for a siege. She found herself looking at her home with a critical eye, seeing its simple roughness through the imagined gaze of a man from a fine Boston brownstone. The chipped paint on the door frame, the worn rug by the hearth, the simple cast-iron pots hanging in the kitchen, all of it seemed suddenly inadequate. The town, of course, had noticed the flurry of activity and the weekly arrival of letters with an expensive Boston postmark. News, especially news of a curious and personal nature, traveled faster than any train. Whispers followed Elara whenever she went to the general store or the post office. She could feel the curious stares, hear the snippets of conversation that halted when she drew near. She knew what they were saying. They thought she was a fool. They thought she was being tricked by some city slicker with a smooth pen, that she would be robbed or abandoned or worse. Their pitying looks and poorly veiled questions were like little barbs, feeding her own private doubts. What if they were right? The morning of November the 12th dawned bright and bitterly cold. A sharp wind sliced across the prairie, carrying the metallic scent of snow. Her nerves were stretched taut. She dressed with more care than usual, choosing her least faded dress and brushing her hair until it shone. The ride into town felt endless, each step of Juniper's hooves a drumbeat counting down to a moment that would change her life forever. The small train station was a scene of quiet activity. A few other people were there, waiting for packages or relatives, and they all turned to look at Elara as she dismounted and tied Juniper to the post. She stood apart, her hands clenched tightly inside her woolen mittens, her eyes fixed on the empty track that stretched toward the eastern horizon. The air vibrated with a low hum that grew steadily into a roar, and then the great iron beast of the train itself appeared, billowing clouds of steam and smoke into the crisp blue sky. It screeched and groaned to a halt, its metal parts hissing like a living thing. The doors clattered open. A few passengers disemboweled, their faces unfamiliar. A traveling salesman with a large case, a family visiting grandparents, a cowboy heading back to work after a trip to Cheyenne. Elara's heart hammered against her ribs. What if he had changed his mind? What if he wasn't on the train at all? And then he appeared. He was exactly like his photograph, yet completely different. He stood in the doorway of the passenger car, tall and straight, dressed in a suit of such fine dark wool it seemed to absorb the sunlight. His shoes were polished to a mirror shine. He carried a single, expensive-looking leather suitcase. He was without a doubt the most out-of-place person Elara had ever seen. He looked like a prince who had accidentally wandered onto a farm. He stepped down onto the platform, his eyes scanning the small crowd. They found hers, and he stilled. For a long moment they simply looked at each other across the dusty platform, two people from different planets finally meeting in the same atmosphere. He was handsomer than his picture, his features more defined, but there was a wariness in his eyes, a deep-seated fatigue that the photograph had only hinted at. He walked toward her, his steps measured and precise on the rough boards. He stopped a few feet away, and she caught a faint scent of soap and something else, something clean and citrusy that she had never smelled before. "He matters. Miss Elara?" Elara said, "Do you want me to take your bag?" "I can manage. I can take your bag." She secured the suitcase with a practiced ease he watched with rapt attention. "You'll ride behind me." He looked at her hand, then at the space behind her on the saddle. For a man who had undoubtedly navigated complex ballrooms and formal dinners with effortless grace, the simple act of getting on a horse appeared to be a monumental challenge. He took her hand, his grip tentative, and attempted to swing his leg over Juniper's back. It was not a graceful maneuver. He stumbled, his fine shoes slipping on the hard ground, and he ended up half on the horse, half off, clinging to her for balance. A hot flush of embarrassment crept up his neck. Elara said nothing. She just waited, patient and still, until he finally managed to right himself and settle awkwardly behind her. He held onto the sides of the saddle, his body rigid, maintaining a careful, polite distance from her. The ride to the ranch was conducted in near total silence, broken only by the sound of Juniper's hooves on the hard ground and the sigh of the wind. Elara was intensely aware of the stranger behind her, of his stillness, of the foreign scent of him that the wind carried to her. She tried to imagine what he was seeing, the endless, barren landscape, the complete absence of people or buildings, the sheer scale of the sky. It was a world away from the crowded, built-up streets of Boston he had described in his letters. When the small ranch house finally came into view, nestled in its shallow valley, it looked smaller and shabbier than ever to Elara's eyes. She felt a pang of shame. How could this compare to what he was used to? She dismounted, and he followed, his movements stiff from the unfamiliar ride. He stood before her home, his expression unreadable. He was looking at the peeling paint, the water pump in the yard, the simple wooden porch. "This is it. It's yours. You take care of all this yourself." It was the first thing he had said that didn't sound like it came from a book of manners. It sounded real. She led him inside. The main room was warm from the fire she had banked in the hearth before leaving. It was simply furnished, a sturdy table, 2 chairs, a worn rug, a bookshelf holding a few precious volumes. His eyes took in every detail, from the cast-iron cook stove to the curtains she had sewn herself. He set his expensive suitcase down on the rough wooden floor, and the sight of it there seemed to symbolize the immense strangeness of the situation. He was here. He was really here. The silence stretched again, thick and heavy with unspoken thoughts. The man from the letters was here in her kitchen, and suddenly Elara had no idea what to do with him. "I expect you're tired from your journey," she said, falling back to the practicalities of hospitality. "I can show you your room. Supper will be in an hour." "Thank you, Elara," and the sound of her name in his calm Boston accent was the strangest thing she had heard all day. "That would be most kind." As she led him to the first week of Alistair Finch's residence on the ranch was a study in profound and often comical dislocation. The man who had navigated the complex social codes of Boston's drawing rooms with innate grace
found himself utterly bewildered by the simple mechanics of rural life. The morning after his arrival, Elara rose before dawn, as was her custom. She found Alistair already awake, dressed not in his fine suit, but in a new pair of denim trousers and a sturdy work shirt he had purchased in Boston in a fit of hopeful preparation. The clothes were stiff and unworn, and he looked like a boy playing dress-up in his father's garments. He stood in the main room looking lost. "The pump," he said, when she entered. "I wish to draw water for the coffee. I observed you doing it yesterday. There seems to be a technique I am missing." He had tried, his soft hands slipping on the cold iron handle, succeeding only in producing a few disappointing drops. This became the pattern of their days. Every task, every single one that Elara performed without a second thought, was a foreign language Alistair had to painstakingly learn. He shadowed her, his expression one of intense concentration, as she fed the chickens. He took meticulous mental notes as she explained how to measure grain for the sheep. He attempted to split firewood, swinging the axe with a terrifying lack of coordination that sent Elara leaping to a safe distance. The logs he did manage to strike merely rolled over, chastising him for his effort. The local ranchers, who sometimes rode by on their way to check on distant stock, would stop and watch for a moment. Elara would see them, a silent, skeptical audience on horseback. They never said anything directly cruel, but their slow smiles and exchanged glances were commentary enough. They saw a city man playing at being a rancher, a spectacle of uselessness. Their judgment was a quiet, constant pressure. The physical toll on Alistair was immediate and brutal. His soft hands, accustomed to holding nothing heavier than a pen, were soon a mess of blisters. That first evening, Elara saw him wince as he tried to pick up his coffee cup. She wordlessly fetched a tin of salve her father had used and placed it on the table between them. "For your hands," she said, not looking at him directly. He looked at the tin, then at his raw palms. A flush of humiliation colored his cheeks. "Thank you," he said, his voice tight. This was the greatest test, not for him, but for Elara's faith. The man who had written such beautiful, understanding letters was currently failing at the most basic elements of the life he had claimed to want. A bitter voice of doubt, sounding suspiciously like the whispers of the townsfolk, hissed in her ear. "He will break. He will see how hard it is. He will be on the next train east." But Alistair Finch did not break. The blisters burst and hardened. The muscles in his back and shoulders, sore to the point of agony after the first day of real labor, slowly began to knit themselves into something stronger. He did not complain, not once. When he failed at a task, he would pause, analyze his error with a quiet intensity, and try again. He asked thoughtful questions. He was a student of the land, and his classroom was the vast, unforgiving prairie. One afternoon, Elara was trying to repair a broken section of fence where Queenie had, once again, found a weakness. Alistair was beside her, holding the posts steady. He was not strong enough to drive them in himself yet, but he could brace them. He watched her every movement, the way she set the post, the angle of her hammer swing. "May I try?" he asked when she paused to wipe her brow. She handed him the hammer, a heavy, well-worn tool. He took it, hefting its unfamiliar weight. His first swing was wild, glancing off the top of the post with a jarring clang. He stopped, recalibrated, and tried again. Swing after awkward swing, he worked at it. His face was beaded with sweat, his breath coming in short gasps. It was slow, inefficient work. Any of the local men could have driven the post in a quarter of the time, but he kept at it, his jaw set with a determination that was starting to become familiar to Elara. Finally the post was set, standing firm and true in the Wyoming earth. Alistair straightened up, his body aching, and looked at the post. He placed a hand on it, testing its solidity. Then he did something Elara had never seen him do before. He smiled. It was not the polite, practiced smile of a society gentleman. It was a true, full, triumphant smile that reached his eyes and lit up his entire face. It was the smile of a man who had created something tangible. "There," he said, with immense satisfaction. In that moment, Elara saw him. Not the failed city man, not the object of the rancher's ridicule, but the man from the letters, the man who longed for a purpose he could see and touch. He was here. He was really here. That small victory marked a turning point. The lessons continued, but the dynamic between them began to subtly shift. It was no longer just teacher and student. It became a partnership. He learned the rhythms of the land. He could predict a change in the weather by the feel of the wind and the look of the clouds. He started to recognize the individual sheep, giving them names that made Elara laugh. The stubborn old ewe was no longer just Queenie to him. She was Her Majesty the Dowager Duchess of the North Pasture. He discovered he had a talent for animal husbandry. He was patient and calm, and the skittish creatures responded to his quiet voice. When a young lamb became trapped in a thicket, it was Alistair who spent an hour on his belly, talking softly to it, before carefully untangling its wool and carrying it back to its mother. Evenings, once silent and awkward, became the best part of their day. They would sit by the hearth, too tired for elaborate conversation, but comfortable in the quiet. Sometimes he would read to her from one of the books he had brought, his voice bringing to life stories of ancient Rome or adventures on the high seas. In return, she would tell him stories of her father, of building the ranch, of winters past. One night, after a particularly long day mending a vast stretch of fence line, they sat in contented exhaustion. Alistair was looking at his hands in the firelight. They had been transformed. The blisters were gone, replaced with a lattice of new calluses. The nails were short and practical, the skin tanned and weathered. "I barely recognize them," he said, not with disgust, but with wonder. "They look like they belong to someone who does something real." Elara looked at her own hands, which had always looked like that. She saw them through his eyes and felt the surge of pride she never knew was there. "They look like your hands now," she said quietly. He looked up from his hands to her face, and the firelight caught the warmth in his eyes. The man who had arrived in a fine suit was gone. In his place was a man in a worn work shirt with dirt under his nails and the quiet confidence of earned skill. The gulf between their worlds was still there, but they were building a bridge across it, hammer swing by hammer swing, word by word. The doubt that had haunted Elara's steps began to recede, replaced by a new and fragile hope. He was not just staying, he was becoming. Winter descended upon the ranch with a profound and silent finality. The world shrank to the boundaries of their own land, isolated by vast drifts of snow that turned the familiar pastures into a featureless sea of white. The sky, once a brilliant, endless blue, became a low, heavy blanket of gray that seemed to press down upon the little house. Inside, however, a new warmth had rooted, a warmth that had little to do with the fire crackling in the hearth. The rhythm of their lives had settled into a comfortable shared cadence. Alistair was no longer a student but a true partner. His body had hardened to the work. His movements around the ranch were sure and capable. He could now split wood with a clean, efficient stroke, tend to the livestock with a calm authority, and predict a coming storm by the particular ache in his once soft hands. The local ranchers, on the rare occasions they braved the weather to check on their isolated neighbor, no longer smiled in silent mockery. They nodded to Alistair with a gruff respect, a language men like them understood. He had earned his place. Evenings were their sanctuary. The world outside might be howling with wind, but inside there was peace. They read together, talked about everything and nothing, and often simply sat in a comfortable silence, each occupied with their own thoughts, yet profoundly aware of the other's presence. Elara's loneliness was a forgotten ghost. She could not imagine a time when this man had not been here, sharing her table, her fire, her life. The future, once narrow and uncertain, now stretched before them, bright with shared purpose. It was on one such evening, with the wind whistling a lonely tune around the eaves, that the past reached out its long, cold finger to touch them. A trip to town for supplies had been delayed for days by the weather, but the larder was growing bare. When the storm finally broke, leaving a...
The silence in the room was a physical presence, thick and heavy as the winter snow outside. Elara could not take her eyes from the invitation lying on the rough wood of their table. The elegant script seemed to writhe under the lamplight, each word a tiny hook pulling at her newfound happiness, threatening to unravel it thread by thread. She saw not an invitation, but a summons, a demand from a world that refused to relinquish its claim on the man sitting across from her. The simple, honest warmth of their home felt suddenly fragile, a tiny candle flame threatened by a great cold wind from the east. She finally forced herself to look at Alistair. His face was unreadable, his gaze still turned inward, locked on some memory or some calculation she could not access. This was the expression of the man who had first arrived, the man who knew about board meetings and social maneuvering. Her heart sank like a stone. This was what she had feared. The sight of his old life, even on paper, had been enough to pull him back into its orbit. The rancher, her partner, had momentarily vanished, replaced by the heir to a fortune. "Your family," she began, her voice sounding small and strained in the quiet room. "They will expect you to be there. They will wonder where you are." The words were a plea and a test all at once. Alistair did not respond immediately. He reached out and picked up the heavy parchment again, his fingers tracing the embossed crest. He seemed to be weighing it, not just the paper, but everything it represented. "They believe I am in Switzerland," he said, his voice distant, almost clinical, "convalescing in the mountain air for my health. A convenient fiction arranged by a discreet family solicitor. They would not expect me to attend. It would in fact be rather disruptive to the story if I did." His tone was so calm, so logical. It was the voice of a man discussing a business matter. It chilled him more than any outburst of longing could have. This was how he had been trained to think. This was how he had lived his entire life, weighing actions based on strategy and appearance, not on desire. Was that what he was doing now? Calculating the most strategically sound path? Her fear curdled into a sharp, aching despair. "And if they found out?" she exclaimed. The question escaped her lips before she could stop it, fueled by a torrent of insecurity. "If someone from Boston traveled through, saw you here, wrote to them, what would you do then?" She gestured around the room, a sweeping motion that took in the humble cabin, the cast-iron stove, the view of the snow-drifted pastures through the window. She was laying her heart bare, revealing the deep hidden fear that had been her constant companion since his arrival. The fear that he would wake up one day and see her life not as a choice, but as a mistake. That he would see her not as a partner, but as a simple, uneducated woman from the wilderness, a fascinating diversion that had ultimately cost him his birthright. Alistair finally looked up from the letter. The distant, calculating look in his eyes faded, replaced by something else. He saw the raw fear on her face, the tears she was fiercely fighting back. He saw the way her hands trembled slightly on the table. The clinical mask fell away, and the man she knew, the man she loved, returned to his eyes. He did not answer her questions with words. Instead, he stood up. He walked around the table until he stood before her. He took the invitation, his gaze holding hers, and without a single glance at it, he turned and dropped it into the fire. Elara gasped. The beautiful, expensive parchment landed on the glowing logs. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a thin line of brown scorched the edge, curling it inward. The flames found purchase, licking hungrily at the paper, consuming the elaborate script, the Vandergilt crest, the very notion of the summer ball. In seconds, it was a blackened curl, and then it was ash, indistinguishable from any other bit of kindling. The act was so final, so absolute it stole the breath from her lungs.
Alistair turned back to her. He knelt before her chair so that his face was level with hers. He reached out and took her work-roughened hands in his own calloused ones, linking them together between them. "Elara," he said, and his voice was soft but filled with conviction that vibrated through his hands into hers. "Look at me." She forced her eyes to meet his, her vision blurred with unshed tears. "When I lived in that world," he began, his thumb gently stroking the back of her hand, "my every move was scheduled, my every word was scripted. I was a prop in my family's play. I spent my days in crowded ballrooms feeling utterly invisible." He squeezed her hands, his grip strong and sure. "Here, with you, I have never been more seen. You see the man who is learning to mend a fence, the man who can tell a ewe from a ram, the man who loves you. That is the man I am. That is the man I want to be." He looked toward the fireplace, where the last fragment of the invitation glowed for an instant before turning to dust. "They have their crystal chandeliers," he whispered, his gaze returning to hers, fierce and loving. "But we have the stars. They have their orchestrated symphonies, but we have the wind and the grasses and the coyote song." He leaned forward, his forehead nearly touching hers. "I did not flee high society for a quiet life, Elara. I fled it for a real one. I fled it for this. I fled it for you." The last of Elara's fear melted away, not slowly, but all at once, like a snowbank yielding to the sudden warmth of the spring sun. The cold dread that had gripped her heart vanished, replaced by a flood of pure, unshakable certainty. The words from his letters, the promises that he had made, had not been just words. He had meant every one. He had chosen her. He had chosen this life, and he would choose it again every single day. The shadow of the past was gone, burned away in their own hearth. All that remained was the light in his eyes and the profound, echoing truth of his choice. He was not Alistair Finch of Boston. He was her Alistair, and he was home.